I've gone through about 1,000 pensions, and here are the 10 worst mistakes that I see being made time and time again. I'm going to take you through each one in turn. Let's start with number one. Low growth. That's probably the number one problem. Roughly 5% over the last 5 years, even when the markets have done incredibly well. And I'll give you a solution to each one of these. Now, how does the low growth element usually happen? First of all, people often haven't looked at their pensions, or when they've looked at them, they've been told by the IFA, this is what you're going to get. You're moderate risk. You shouldn't be taking more. And they've been put into a bunch of mediocre funds generating 5% on a spray and pray basis. And then every time they've raised this as a question, or worse still, they've not even bothered to raise it as a question. Anytime they've raised it as a question, they've been told, don't worry, the fund manager's changed. This has improved. We're going to put you into these. We're on top of it. And that's bought the IFA more time. Let's look at number two. And as I said, I will come to solutions on each of these. Secondly, they trusted a brand name. Now, the brand names which I get the most complaints about are usually St. James's Place, L&G, Vanguard, Fidelity, Fisher, all the ones that you see with huge marketing budgets. And they trust the brand name for obvious reasons. It's a brand name. Surely, if it's got 1 million clients, they must be doing rather well. And again, the problem there becomes that those companies are very good at marketing, but as the academic literature shows, and I've published it in my Financial Times columns and in my 18-odd books as well, as the academic literature shows, the hot hand fund will market more and will revert to mean. In other words, they'll have a good year, they'll do lots of marketing. The year after, their performance will be incredibly poor because they'll go back to mean reversion. It's a bit like the person who throws 10 heads on a coin and says, hey, invest with me. I'm really good at flipping coins. Of course, the next 10 flips are just random. And this has been proven by Nobel Prize winner Eugene Fama as well. Let's look at mistake number 3. They didn't realize how much they would need. Now, this one's really easy to solve. The reason they didn't realize how much they would need in retirement is because it's very difficult to know and have tools. I created some free ones because this kept coming up, and I'll give you the links in a moment, where you can put into the free calculators exactly how much you might need and work it out. And I made it completely free, and there's no need for, and even entering your email, you don't have to do. Okay, so how much you need and working that out is a key pointer to success. Let's look now at number 4. They saved too much because they were growing too little. Now, you might think, surely nobody can save too much. Surely saving money is the right thing. Well, it's what the IFA wants you to do. They want you to save as much as possible. The reason people were saving more is because their projections as to how much money they would end up having were quite low. And the projections were low. And I'm all for belt and braces and safety and working on a worst case scenario. But the reason the projections were low is because that's all the wealth manager IFA could actually give them. 3.5%, 4%, 5%, barely beating bank interest plus inflation. So the people ended up saving a lot more, going through a lot more pain of saving. Because let's not forget, if you're saving, you're sacrificing at the same time. There's always something you could have been spending on instead. And in the case of many of them, when you just improved growth a tiny bit, what you found was they could easily have saved less, accumulated more. Sort of related to the previous one. And again, in terms of working these things out, when we show them what happens with their portfolios, if they just improve return slightly and go, instead of there, to get the more superior returns that you can get with just basic index trackers, actually, then they could have saved pretty much 50% less than they actually ended up doing. So let's have a look at number 5. That's where we're up to. On number 5, they thought a world tracker ETF was enough. So very often they would just sort of see all of these points mentioned and they'd come back and they'd say, that's okay, I just have the world tracker index. Now, the problem with that was that if they were willing and able to take the volatility and the risk of a world tracker, just an index tracker, something which just tracks a basket of stocks which are global and diversified, then usually they could have, for the same amount of volatility or risk that they'd be taking, is get far better, superior returns. So what they were doing was they were going through the pain of stock price movements, but not getting the kinds of returns they should have been getting. So again, I'm going to give you solutions for all of these in just a second. But that was a common point that I discovered. And I asked them, well, okay, look, this is how much it moved up and down. They said, no, to get more on top of it, I just know to buy and forget and leave it alone. So well, if you're willing to take those dips, you do know you could easily have had a portfolio which would have done double the return. And that's when it came as a shock to me. I said, oh, okay, how do we do that? Well, you didn't need to have the 500 stocks or 1,000 or 10,000 stocks, however many in the world tracker. We could have just focused on some of the best blue chip companies out of there, and you would have done significantly better and still had the same amount of volatility. Let's now look at number 6. They thought they were already exposed to some good growth stocks. Now, this is again coming back to the IFA. The IFA will have told them, don't worry, you've got a bit of whatever it is, JP Morgan, Nvidia, Palantir, Costco, Goldman Sachs, whatever it is, don't worry, you've got your Apple or Microsoft. The problem was they didn't look deeply enough and realize they had next to nothing, because what happened is it was in a fund and only a part of their money was in that fund, and the fund itself had only a couple of percentage points in those stocks. So, and if it did have, I don't know, 5%, 6, 7% in a great growth company, the rest of the stocks had 2%, 1%, less than 1% very often. So there's a lot of that internal churn and cost. Wasn't enough growth. They thought they had coverage because they got these thick reports, but they didn't actually have it. Number 7, they chased funds. So they then asked, well, what's the answer? And they felt, oh, maybe I've just got a bad fund manager or the like. And so they kept chasing different funds. They said, okay, well, if it's not that fund with St. James's Place or whoever, which fund is it? Which IFA? What's the answer then? So they're asking exactly the wrong question, because all of the IFAs have their hands tied by putting money into funds. Funds, because they have lots of money to spend and they commoditize the business because they've got lots of clients, they end up creating just a few categories of funds and picking from a narrow gene pool of companies. So a UK fund, a US one, and people thinking, oh, well, I'm diversified. I've got UK and US and Europe and Far East. I must be diversified. But if you're picking from a small gene pool of companies, such as just UK ones or just even US ones, then typically what tends to happen is that you've got too little money into the good companies and you've picked from very few companies to begin with. So you restricted your choice. Statistically, again, Eugene Fama got the Nobel Prize in Economics for proving this. You're just not going to do as well as if you had a free hand like a Warren Buffett does. I'll pick any companies I want. Anyway, so they kept chasing funds. That didn't solve the more underlying fundamental problem, which is whichever funds they went to, the funds had too little money in too few good companies, okay, by the very structure of those funds and their IFA. So they'd keep asking, well, which fund, which IFA? Was the wrong question. Again, I'll come to some of the answers that you need for this. Let's move to point number 8. They didn't know where to start. So if you take somebody, say, just straightforward as my aunt who is a school teacher, and you make all these points to her, and you say, well, do you now know what to do? And they go, no, of course I don't. They didn't know, well, how do you open your own personal pension or even an ISA? How much can you contribute to your pension if your workplace is already contributing to it, or if you've already got a SIP in place? They didn't know this. And of course, if you can open an online bank account, you can open your own online pension. And you can buy a stock very easy. You might go to a Free Trade or a Barclays or a Hargreaves Lansdown or an AJ Bell or Interactive Brokers, whoever it is. Just like you open an online bank account, you open an account, and just like you might buy something online, you buy $1,000 worth of Microsoft stock, for argument's sake. I'm not saying that's the one you buy. But given that people could buy things online and knew how to open online accounts, they were suddenly frightened to do the exact same thing by opening an online pension, which the IFAs love, the fact that people were too scared. So again, I'll give you some solutions. Number 9, they didn't know best and worst case scenarios for their retirement. So I'm going to give you all these free resources in a second. So what we did is we created the tools for them so they could play around and stress test it. We created these completely for free, all completely for free. Okay, so they could work around with whatever their starting value is and what would be the stress test. Now, why would you need to stress test a portfolio? Well, the reason is you might do well because there's some very good years. You might do poorly because there's some bad years. And guess what? Those bad years might come early when you're withdrawing money. So sequencing risk, as it's called, may mean you run out of money and you probably want to test a few of these things. But you certainly don't want to be paying thousands in fees in order to be doing all of this. So we created a free tool for people to play around. I'm going to say that word free again, because they were currently paying thousands to have IFAs do all of this for them. And then they could see that actually I might not run out of risk, or they could rebalance each year and say, well, actually this year we better spend a little bit less because the market's had a bad year. And that way we won't run out of money. And they could see how it could potentially grow. And also if they had poor expectations, or if things are going well and they've gone as well as they've done in the past, what would then happen in terms of their terminal wealth, as it were, how much they might leave for retirement. And some said, well, actually, never mind retirement. I don't want to leave anything to the kids. I don't need to. So they could calculate accordingly. Now, these tools, probably more sophisticated than IFAs and wealth managers used, by putting them in the hands of the private investor themselves, meant, first of all, they had the knowledge, they had the information. Making it free meant they had access to it. They don't even have to give their email address, as I've said. But it suddenly leveled the playing field a lot. It also meant that they didn't have to wait for the annual or monthly meeting with the guru, high expensive IFA or fund manager. They could just play around with it during the year. They could say, well, these are things that are going, or I've had a windfall. I don't need to pay extra fees to go and now recalculate things, and I can print it out very simply. That was essential, we felt. Anyway, that's didn't know best and worst cases. Now let's look at the final one. I could go on to about 20 of these, but I'll just do the top 10. DIY, when they did do it themselves, they'd had a bad experience. They might be professionals, they might be business owners who've sold their business for millions. They at long last thought, do you know what, I better do this myself. But when they did it themselves, because they were relying on newsletters, because they thought that's what you do, or newspaper tips, or tip sheets, or social media videos, they'd end up panicking. Because, of course, it's very easy for somebody to say, this is when you buy, but very rarely do they say sell. And even if they say sell, very rarely do they actually know, if ever, your own risk appetite. What's the drawdown and the falls you can take? So it's easy for a newsletter to say, well, buy this stock, we think it'll go up. And if it drops 50%, they'll say, well, I think just hold through it, you'll be fine. There's just no responsibility. So these people were then put off managing their own and went back to the IFAs. Anyway, as I said, I've given 10 for now. But there are many more I could do. It's all part of my campaign to teach 1 million people around the world how to improve their investing education and add an extra 1 million to their pensions across their lifetimes. So if you want to have all those free tools and calculators and everything else that I've just shown you, as well as a free educational pension review, just go to the website campaignfor1million.com, campaignfor1million.com, and you will get all of those tools, the education. You can even give us a call and we'll give you free educational one-to-one call to get you started. If you still don't know, well, I don't know where to begin. We've invested at our own cost to have people speak to you and say, right, this is where you start. This is the bits, because it's just too much to take in. I get that. And the way I looked at it was, well, and I've got a big team behind me, how would I want to do it if my aunt was asking these questions? I'd want to have a call, for instance. So anyway, have a look at campaignfor1million.com. I hope that was helpful, and I'll dive more deeply into each of these in due course as well. Thank you very much.